Libraries, quiet, safe, filled with knowledge. But some knowledge should stay buried. When the lights flicker and the last visitor leaves, the silence isn't empty, it's watching, waiting. Shadows stretch where they shouldn't, whispers rise from forgotten pages, and some books read you back. Here are 5 true horror stories from libraries around the world. Chilling proof that the dead don't always leave, and some things lurking in the stacks were never human to begin with. Watch the full video if you dare. But be warned, once you know these stories, the library will never feel the same again. It began on an unremarkable autumn evening in Massachusetts, when the wind whispered secrets through the ancient bricks of the town library. Claire, a quiet librarian with a gentle smile and eyes that seemed to hide untold stories, spent her days among the dusty shelves and fading pages of history. But that evening, something felt unsettling, as if the very air vibrated with a secret, a presence lurking just beyond sight. In the far corner of her vision, where the light and shadow tangled in an eerie dance, she first caught a glimpse of him, a tall, slender figure in an old-fashioned suit. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his expression was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat that cast deep shadows over his face. Every time Claire turned her head, hoping to get a clearer look, he was gone, vanished as if swallowed by the darkness. At first, she told herself it was nothing more than stress, just a trick of her tired eyes, a fleeting hallucination born of long hours among musty books. But then came the whispers, soft murmurs that seemed to float from the very walls, echoing between the shelves. They spoke in hushed tones, almost pleading, almost warning. Don't look too closely. The sound was low, insidious, and it seeped into the silence of the library even when no one else was around. One chilly evening, as the library's closing time neared, Claire stayed behind to tidy up. Locking the main door with trembling fingers, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A slow, deliberate sound of footsteps echoing in the deserted corridors. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. She spun around sharply and found nothing but a long, shadowed hallway that stretched into an unsettling silence. The footsteps, they had been there undeniably, but now they were gone. The following day, unable to shake the dread that had gripped her, Claire decided to review the security footage. With shaking hands and a mind filled with apprehension, she watched the grainy video. There, in aisle 13, stood the man in the suit, frozen in time. For nearly 3 hours, he remained motionless, staring straight ahead as if he were a portrait rather than a man. And then, in the blink of an eye, he vanished, leaving behind nothing but an empty frame and a silence that screamed. That night, sleep was a distant memory. Every creak in the building, every rustle of wind against the window, echoed the sound of unseen footsteps. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the corners of her room, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't have seen." The words repeated in her mind over and over, like a broken record of fear. It was as if the very presence of that man had seeped into every crevice of her reality. Desperate for answers, Claire returned to the library the next day. Despite knowing that stepping back inside might shatter the fragile barrier between the known and the unknown. The once safe haven of books and history had transformed into a labyrinth of secrets and unseen watchers. As she walked down the familiar aisles, each step echoed with a foreboding finality. The silence was oppressive, laden with the weight of unspoken things. And in the stillness, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling but determined, as though daring the darkness to reveal its mystery. There was no clear answer, only a disjointed series of sounds. A soft click here, a hushed whisper there, and a rustling that might have been pages turning in the wind. Then, without warning, a door slammed open with a ferocity that shattered the quiet, scattering ancient papers across the floor. In that brief, chaotic moment, she felt a cold presence brush past her. A spectral caress that left her breathless and questioning the boundaries between life and the afterlife. That final encounter proved to be the last straw. The very next day, with her hands still trembling and her mind a storm of fear and confusion, Claire handed in her resignation. As she packed her belongings, she cast one last, lingering glance back at the library. There, in the dim light of the early morning, she swore she saw a faint, shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching silently, as if it were both a guardian of secrets and a harbinger of doom. The building itself seemed to sigh with the weight of its dark history, as if mourning her departure. Days melted into weeks, yet the memory of the man who wasn't really there, continued to haunt Claire. In the quiet moments of her new, more ordinary life, she could almost feel the cold weight of his unseen stare. Each morning, as she sipped her coffee and gazed out of her window, a part of her remained back in that eerie library, forever tethered to the mystery of his presence. And at night, her dreams became filled with dark hallways, flickering lights, and a chorus of whispers that defied all logic. Friends noticed a change in her. The once vibrant and cheerful librarian had grown withdrawn, her eyes reflecting not just sorrow, but a terror that lurked just below the surface. "Are you all right?" they would ask, and she would only offer a weak smile, an attempt to mask the horror that had taken root deep inside her soul. She never spoke of that night, of the footsteps and the chilling whispers, for she feared that in doing so, she might awaken something far worse than mere memories. Late one night, as the world outside slumbered, and the only sounds were the soft hum of distant traffic and the whisper of the wind, Claire awoke with a start. In the heavy silence of her darkened room, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the floor, a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed with an uncanny familiarity. She lay frozen in bed, eyes wide and heart pounding, unable to tear her gaze from the darkness. And for a long, agonizing moment, she was certain that the man in the suit had come for her, that his spectral presence had finally crossed the boundary from memory into reality. But when the clock ticked past the witching hour, and the footsteps faded away into the night, all that remained was the oppressive silence and a lingering question. Was he ever truly there, or had she been haunted by her own fears? The uncertainty gnawed at her, day by day, until every shadow in her life seemed imbued with a silent menace. In the weeks and months that followed, Claire sought refuge in the mundane routines of everyday life. Yet the library's memory clung to her like cobwebs in a forgotten attic, ever present, ever watchful. Even mundane tasks like reading or taking a walk through the park were tinged with an inexplicable unease, as if the world itself had become a stage for unseen phantoms. On one particularly foggy afternoon, as she wandered through a small Massachusetts town, she passed by an old, abandoned building that had once been a community center. For a split second, she thought she saw the familiar silhouette, a tall figure in an old suit, standing at the window, staring out with that same implacable stillness. Her breath caught in her throat, and she hurried on, her mind reeling with the possibility that the mysterious presence had followed her beyond the library walls. That day, as rain began to fall in soft, relentless drizzles, Claire realized with a sinking certainty that some mysteries are not confined to a single place. The man who wasn't there had become a part of her, a lingering whisper in the back of her mind, a shadow that danced at the periphery of every bright day and every dark night. It was as though his spectral form had imprinted itself on her soul, a constant reminder that sometimes the unseen can be far more terrifying than what is visible. Now, whenever the wind picks up and the sky grows dark, Claire can almost hear his silent footsteps, echoing in the corridors of her memories. The library, with its creaking floors and whispering walls, had offered her a glimpse into a world where the boundaries between the living and the lost blur into something indescribably eerie. And though she has moved on, haunted yet resilient, the presence of that enigmatic figure remains, a ghostly reminder that not all that is unseen is benign. For in the end, the man who wasn't there is perhaps the one thing that will forever be present, lurking, waiting, and watching from the shadows. At Riverbend College in Ohio, the library was usually a quiet haven, an organized sanctuary of knowledge, bathed in soft light and lined with endless rows of books. But one autumn afternoon, as the diligent college librarian Alice was doing her routine inventory, she discovered something that would shatter that calm forever. Tucked away in a dark, forgotten corner of the history section, a thick, leather-bound book sat incongruously on a dusty shelf. It seemed to have no place among the familiar titles. There was no barcode, no catalog entry, no record in the system, only the faded, ornate letters on its cover, spelling out the title, The Hollow Ones. Alice's heart skipped a beat. Something about the book felt off. With hesitant curiosity, she reached for it. The leather was cool and strangely supple under her fingers, as if it had absorbed some otherworldly chill. Opening the cover, Alice found pages filled with meticulous, flowing handwriting in a language she couldn't recognize. But the most unsettling detail was the ink. It was still wet, glistening as if it had been written just moments before. A shiver crawled up her spine. How could this be? She wondered, glancing around the silent stacks as if expecting to see someone watching her. That night, sleep proved elusive. In the dark of her small apartment, Alice was plagued by a dream that felt all too real. At the foot of her bed, looming in the half-light, stood figures, tall, thin, and completely faceless. Their limbs hung unnaturally as if carved from shadows, and they exuded a presence that was both ominous and mournful. Their silent vigil, punctuated only by the faint sound of wet ink scratching on paper, left her trembling in fear. The figures whispered in unison, a cold, indistinct murmur that seemed to say, "We are the Hollow Ones." When morning came, she awoke with her heart pounding, the memory of those faceless beings etched into her mind. Rushing to her bedside table, Alice expected to find the book waiting for her, but it was gone, vanished without a trace. The empty space on the table was as eerie as it was inexplicable. She checked the shelves at the library later that day, but no one else had seen the book. Had it been a trick of her imagination? Or had the book somehow slipped between worlds, existing one moment and then disappearing the next? Over the next few days, whispers began to circulate among the students. In hushed tones, they spoke of a mysterious volume that appeared when no one was looking. Some claimed that if you were alone in the library, on a quiet, isolated night, you might catch a glimpse of a thick, leather-bound book resting on a shelf where it didn't belong. Others insisted that the book's title, The Hollow Ones, shone faintly in the dim light, and that if you dared to open it, the ink would be wet with fresh, forbidden words. The more they talked, the more it seemed that the book had taken on a life of its own, a spectral presence that defied logic. Late one rainy evening, a lone student named Jeremy found himself lingering in the library long after closing time. He had heard the rumors. Curiosity gnawed at him, urging him to see if the stories were true. Wandering through the dim corridors, with only the erratic flicker of an old light bulb to guide him, he stumbled upon a secluded corner. There, lying on a forgotten shelf, was the same thick, dust-covered volume. His breath caught in his throat. With trembling hands, he picked up the book. The leather felt cool and invitingly smooth, yet there was an undeniable chill that sent shivers along his arms. Opening the book, Jeremy was met with the same strange, handwritten script, the words flowing in a language that defied recognition. And once again, the ink was unmistakably wet, as if it had been applied just moments before. Before he could process what he was witnessing, he heard it, a soft, sibilant whisper echoing from the shadows. "Leave." The sound was barely audible, yet it filled the vast silence of the library with a dreadful urgency. In a heartbeat, the book snapped shut on its own, as if in anger or warning, and Jeremy bolted from the building, leaving behind only the lingering echo of that ominous command. Back on campus, the legend of the Hollow Ones grew with every retelling. Students spoke of eerie occurrences, a glint of gold on a dark leather cover seen out of the corner of one's eye, a soft rustle of pages in an empty room, a sudden, inexplicable chill that seemed to follow you through the corridors. No one knew for sure if the book was real, or if it was merely a spectral rumor born of collective imagination. But the details were too consistent, too precise, to be dismissed as mere urban legend. For Alice, the experience left an indelible mark. Every time she walked past that isolated shelf, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The memory of the wet ink, the strange, indecipherable language, and the nightmare of faceless figures haunted her every step. The library, once a place of order and calm, had transformed into a labyrinth of whispered secrets and looming shadows. A place where the boundary between the known and the unknown had blurred into something terrifying. As autumn gave way to winter, the campus itself seemed to fall under a spectral spell. Fog crept in over the quad, shrouding the buildings in a ghostly haze, and long, dark evenings made even the familiar halls of the library seem ominous. One particularly cold night, while Alice was locking up, she thought she heard a faint, rhythmic tapping emanating from one of the remote stacks. With her heart pounding in her chest, She followed the sound down a narrow corridor. At the end of it, in a forgotten corner lit only by a flickering overhead bulb, she glimpsed a flash, a glimmer of leather that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, Alice was convinced that the book was toying with her, a silent challenge issued in the dead of night. In the ensuing weeks, every whisper, every shadow in the library took on a new, sinister meaning. Students reported encounters that defied explanation. Brief sightings of a book resting in an unexpected place, the unmistakable smell of old leather mixed with something otherworldly. Some even claimed that if you dared to open the book, the figures from your dreams would appear, their faceless expressions filled with silent despair. Alice kept a careful record of these incidents, though she never spoke of the book directly to her superiors. Her voice, usually so steady and calm, trembled when she recounted the events to anyone who would listen. Yet even as she warned them, a part of her wondered if perhaps some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. After all, The Hollow Ones was more than just a book. It was a doorway to something ancient, something that defied the confines of time and reason. In the end, the cursed volume became an integral part of Riverbend College's dark lore. It was a legend whispered in the quiet hours of the night, a cautionary tale for those who dared to delve too deeply into the secrets of the library. And though the physical book was never seen again, vanishing as mysteriously as it had appeared, its presence lingered. Every so often, when the campus was empty and the wind howled like a restless spirit, a student would claim to have seen it. That same thick, leather-bound book with wet ink and a title that glowed faintly in the darkness. A book that should not exist, yet does. Thus, the legacy of the Hollow Ones endures. A chilling reminder that some books are not meant to be found, and that certain mysteries are best left undisturbed. In the quiet corners of the library, when the lights flicker and the silence becomes almost too loud, one can almost hear the soft scratch of a pen on paper and the echo of faceless figures whispering, "Leave." And so, the book that shouldn't exist remains a dark enigma, a spectral presence in a world that is all too willing to believe in the power of its own secrets. In 2014, on a bleak, rain-soaked evening in England, the old library exuded a strange, timeless aura. Its stone walls and creaking floors whispered secrets of ages past, a past that, on that night, would come back to haunt those who dared disturb it. Nigel, the longtime janitor of the library, was finishing his routine rounds in the basement when the night took a terrifying turn. Nigel had always taken pride in his work. He knew every corner of the building, every dusty shelf and hidden nook. Yet that evening, as he made his way down the narrow, winding staircase to the basement, a chill ran down his spine, a premonition he couldn't quite shake. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, as if the darkness itself were pressing in on him. At the foot of the stairs, he reached the heavy iron door that led out of the basement and into the main hall. With practiced ease, he slid the key into the lock, but before he could turn it, a sudden, violent gust of wind roared through the corridor. With a deafening bang, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing off the stone walls like the final toll of a bell. Nigel's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for his flashlight. The beam sputtered to life, its weak light trembling as it swept across the vast, musty space of the basement. The room was shrouded in darkness, its contours hidden beneath layers of shadow. An overpowering smell filled the air, a mix of damp, rotting paper and something else, something metallic and bitter that made his stomach twist. "Hello," he called out, his voice quivering as it reverberated against the cold, hard walls. He pounded on the heavy iron door with desperate force, each knock louder than the last, hoping someone in the main hall would hear him. But his cries were swallowed by the oppressive silence, a silence that felt as though it were alive. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly in that stifling gloom. Then, amidst the hush, something peculiar caught his eye. On one of the tall, creaking bookshelves, a book shifted, ever so slightly. At first, it appeared as if it had simply fallen, but upon closer inspection, Nigel realized that the book moved of its own accord. Not in a chaotic tumble, but in a slow, deliberate motion, as if guided by an unseen hand. His breath caught. He strained his eyes in the dim light, and then he saw it. The books were not just falling or being jostled. They were sliding from one shelf to another, rearranging themselves into patterns that made no sense. The sound was barely audible, a soft rustling like the whisper of dry leaves, but in that dead, silent basement, it roared in his ears. Before he could comprehend what was happening, a raspy, broken voice slithered out from the shadows. It was low and guttural, a sound that clawed at the edges of his sanity. "Nigel!" The word was drawn out, each syllable heavy with malice and sorrow. The voice echoed around him, bouncing off the walls and sent shivers racing along his spine. He froze, the flashlight trembling in his grasp as he stared into the darkness, searching for its source. "Who's there?" He managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. But the answer was only more darkness and that terrible, repeating call of his name. The sound grew louder, more insistent. "Nigel. Nigel. Nigel." As if the very basement were alive and calling him to an unknown fate. The books continued to move, shifting imperceptibly as if they were part of a silent, secret ritual. Nigel's mind raced. Had he disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed? Was this the result of some ancient curse hidden within the library's depths? His rational thoughts warred with the primal terror rising in his chest. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to find a way out of that haunted space. Yet the iron door loomed ahead, unyielding, its surface cold and impassive. The air itself seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and the metallic tang grew stronger, biting at his senses. Every second in that basement stretched into an eternity. The whisper of his name, now unmistakably close, seemed to come from all around him, a chorus of unseen voices, each repeating his name in that raspy tone. The sound was maddening, echoing through his mind until he felt as though he might lose himself in the darkness. And then, abruptly, the movement stopped. The books stilled, as if a spell had been broken, and the oppressive hush descended once more. For a long, heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, as if the silence itself was conspiring to make him doubt his own senses, the basement floor seemed to tilt beneath him. The flash of his dying light revealed deep scratches on the stone walls, marks that looked as if they had been made by claws. Fear overwhelmed him, and exhaustion began to creep in. The relentless terror, combined with the unnatural stillness, sapped his strength. It was not long before darkness claimed him entirely. When Nigel awoke, he was in a stark hospital room, the harsh fluorescent lights a cruel contrast to the shadowy basement he could not forget. He lay in a narrow bed, his skin pale and clammy, his arms bearing deep, ragged scratches. Scratches that looked as if they had been inflicted by something not quite human. A thick layer of dust clung to him, as though he had been buried for days, even though only hours had passed since his ordeal. Doctors and nurses crowded around him, their faces etched with concern and bewilderment. Nigel tried to explain what had happened, his voice trembling as he recalled the heavy door, the shifting books, and that unearthly whisper calling his name. But every time he opened his mouth, the memory of the voice, Nigel, rushed back, and he fell silent, unable to finish the tale. The investigation that followed was as fruitless as it was baffling. Library officials and local authorities scoured the sealed-off basement, searching for any evidence that could explain the inexplicable events of that night. They found no mechanical faults, no signs of sabotage, nothing that could account for the strange phenomena. The books lay undisturbed, the heavy iron door remained immovable, and the damp, metallic smell had vanished as if it were nothing more than a figment of Nigel's fevered imagination. But everyone who had heard Nigel's fragmented account felt the icy grip of unease. The library, a venerable institution with a history as thick as the dust on its shelves, had gained a new and sinister reputation. The management, in a bid to quell public concern and prevent further incidents, sealed off the basement permanently. They boarded up the heavy iron door and declared that the space was closed to the public, locked away, like a forbidden chapter in the library's dark history. Yet, despite the physical barrier, whispers persisted. Staff members and local residents spoke in hushed tones about the basement, about the night when something beyond understanding had reached out from the darkness. Some claimed that on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the library's empty corridors, they could hear soft, desperate whispers, like a spectral chorus calling out for release. Others swore they saw fleeting shadows near the sealed door, as if the basement's secrets were eager to break free. Nigel, once a man known for his steady, reliable nature, was never the same again. He refused to speak about that night, not in detail, and sometimes not at all. His eyes, once warm and kind, now held a haunted look, as if he were forever trapped in the memory of that dreadful evening. Colleagues noticed he would flinch at the slightest sound, jump at shadows that moved just a fraction too quickly, and sometimes, in the dead of night, they would catch him murmuring softly, almost as if in conversation with the darkness. Even now, years later, the sealed basement of that ancient library remains a subject of dark rumor. New staff members are warned, sometimes in vague, trembling whispers, never to venture near the boarded-up door, for fear of awakening whatever sleeps beneath. The legend of the library basement has grown into a modern ghost story, passed along from one anxious ear to another, a chilling reminder that some places harbor secrets best left undisturbed. In the quiet moments, when the world is cloaked in darkness and the only sound is the distant echo of one's own heartbeat, you might imagine that raspy, insistent voice drifting on the wind. Nigel. A whisper from a place where the past and the present intertwine in a tapestry of terror. And if you listen too closely, you might even believe that, somewhere deep within the sealed basement, the shifting books and the echoing shadows await the next curious soul to call out their name. For Nigel, the truth of that night remains locked away, a private horror he carries with him, a secret too dreadful to share. His silence speaks volumes, a living testament to the inexplicable and the unexplainable. And though the library has moved on, its halls filled with the mundane clatter of daily life, the memory of that night lingers, a ghostly presence in the back of everyone's mind. Thus the legend endures, a sealed door, a forgotten basement, and a haunting whisper that dares to call your name when the world is shrouded in darkness. The library basement is not merely a place. It is a reminder that even the most ordinary buildings may hide unimaginable horrors just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to make themselves known, and to remind us that some secrets are better left in the dark. Marianne had been a librarian for over 20 years at the Old County Library in a small Texas town, a place where the dusty scent of aged paper mingled with the quiet hum of whispered stories. The building, with its creaking floors and towering shelves, had long been a sanctuary for the curious and the quiet alike. But nothing in Marianne's long, steady routine could have prepared her for the day she first noticed her. It began one unremarkable afternoon. Marianne was reshelving books in the children's section when she saw a little girl sitting alone in a corner. The child was pale, with long, dark hair that cascaded around her shoulders like a silken veil. She wore an old-fashioned dress, its fabric frayed at the edges, as if it had been pulled straight from another time. The girl sat cross-legged on a faded rug, intently flipping through a large, dusty picture book, her eyes scanning the pages in a silent, steady rhythm. But no matter how many times Marianne glanced over, the girl never spoke a word. At first, Marianne assumed the child was simply shy, a quiet soul drawn to the magic of stories, lost in a world of her own. Yet as days turned into weeks, the little girl appeared again and again, always at the same small table in the corner. She never played with the other children, never laughed or cried, merely existed in a perpetual state of stillness, her gaze fixed on the printed images. There was something eerie about her presence, a subtle wrongness that Marianne couldn't shake. One crisp morning, as golden sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, a new staff member, Tom, approached the table where the silent girl sat. With a friendly smile and gentle tone, he asked, "Hey there, sweetheart, where are your parents?" His question echoed softly in the quiet room. The girl lifted her eyes slowly, those dark eyes so deep and empty, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "They don't know I'm here." The words sent a chill down Tom's spine. He blinked, unsure if he had really heard her, or if it was just the silence playing tricks on his mind. The sound, soft and forlorn, was like a secret meant for no one but the shadows. Tom's unease grew, and he hurried away, leaving the little girl to her silent vigil. But the image of her hollow eyes and the echo of her whisper lingered long after he left. That evening, as the library emptied and the last of the visitors trickled out into the cool twilight, Marianne decided to review the security footage. With a heavy heart and a mind full of questions, she sat in the small security office at the back of the library, watching the grainy video from the children's section. To her disbelief, the screen showed an empty chair at the very spot where the girl had sat that morning. There was no sign of the pale child with the long dark hair. No flutter of a dress, no turning of a page, nothing at all. It was as if she had never been there. The footage looped over the same empty scene for minutes on end, an unsettling void that mocked Marianne's very senses. Marianne's hands trembled as she replayed the footage. Could it be that her mind was playing tricks on her? Had she imagined the girl entirely? But deep down, Marianne knew that the encounter was all too real. The memory of the whisper, the silent, spectral presence that had drawn her attention. Determined to find answers, she confided in her colleagues, who listened with a mixture of concern and skepticism. Whispers of a ghostly child began to ripple through the staff, each recounting their own brush with the inexplicable. Weeks later, during a quiet afternoon filled with the rustle of turning pages and the soft murmur of patrons, an elderly visitor named Mrs. Abernathy approached Marianne at the front desk. Her eyes, once bright with the warmth of bygone days, now held a look of stark terror as she leaned in close, her voice a trembling whisper. "I've heard the story of the silent girl," she said. "I know who she is." Marianne's heart pounded. "Who?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the library. With shaking hands, Mrs. Abernathy reached into the folds of her worn cardigan and pulled out a small, faded envelope. Inside lay a black and white photograph, its edges yellowed with age. Marianne took it with reverence and stared at the image. A little girl with the same long, dark hair and the same old-fashioned dress, her eyes vacant yet filled with sorrow. At the bottom of the photograph was a date, 1932. "She died in a fire," Mrs. Abernathy whispered, her voice quivering. This was her favorite place. The revelation struck Marianne like a bolt of lightning. The library, with all its hidden corners and forgotten memories, was more than just a building filled with books. It was a mausoleum of lost souls, a keeper of untold tragedies. The photograph, as if speaking of its own dark history, bore the mark of a life ended too soon, a spirit bound to the place where she once found solace among the stories. As the days passed, the legend of the silent girl grew. Staff members began to notice strange occurrences. The soft sound of pages turning when no one was around, a faint rustle that echoed through the halls after closing time, and that unnerving whisper of, "They don't know I'm here." Marianne found herself glancing over her shoulder more often, the image of the little girl haunting her every quiet moment. The library, once a sanctuary of calm and order, had become a stage for an unspoken drama, one that played out in the twilight between the living and the dead. Late one stormy night, when the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls and the rain pounded the library's ancient windows, Marianne stayed after hours to reread the photo's backstory. In a dusty, forgotten corner of the archive room, she discovered old newspaper clippings and records detailing the fire of 1932, a tragedy that had claimed the life of a little girl in a nearby orphanage. According to the reports, the girl had been taken in by a kind family, but the fire had swept through the building, trapping her inside. In the aftermath, some whispered that her spirit had found refuge in the one place where she had felt safe, the library, where the magic of books promised an eternal escape. The more Marianne read, the more she felt a deep, sorrowful connection to the silent girl. It was as if the child's spirit was reaching out, silently pleading to be remembered, to be heard even in her spectral silence. Yet, every time Marianne tried to speak of the girl with her colleagues, the words would catch in her throat, replaced by an overwhelming sadness that left her breathless. One chilly morning, as autumn leaves danced outside the library's stained glass windows, Marianne discovered a new addition to the children's section. A small, handwritten note tucked between the pages of an old fairy tale. It read in delicate, almost desperate handwriting, "I am still here." The note sent shivers down her spine, confirming that the silent girl was not a mere ghost of memory, but an active presence in the library's haunted halls. Now, every creak of the floorboard and every soft whisper of turning pages became a reminder that some souls never truly leave. Marianne began to leave a small bouquet of wildflowers on the table where the silent girl once sat, a silent tribute to a life that was snuffed out too soon. She never spoke of the arrangement to anyone, but it was her small way of acknowledging the sorrowful truth, that the girl was still there, in every shadow and every whisper of the library. And so, the legend of the silent girl endured, passed from one anxious listener to the next. In hushed conversations over the clatter of keyboards and the soft murmur of readers, the tale grew, an ever-expanding story of loss, mystery, and the unbreakable bond between a spirit and the place that had been her sanctuary. Every visitor who walked through the library's grand, echoing halls felt, if only for a moment, the chill of that spectral presence. A reminder that in every quiet corner of our lives, there may be echoes of those long gone, still longing to be seen, still desperate to be heard. Marian often wondered if the silent girl was a warning, a gentle reminder that some histories are best left undisturbed. But as she gazed out at the empty reading room, filled only with the soft glow of twilight and the rustle of forgotten pages, she couldn't help but feel that the girl was, in some strange way, protecting the library, a guardian of stories, a keeper of memories. In the end, the silent girl became more than a ghostly figure. She was a symbol of the enduring power of memory and the way our pasts can haunt us in the most unexpected places. Her quiet, sorrowful presence was a testament to the fragility of life, a reminder that even in silence, every soul has a story worth telling, even if that story is written in the silent language of the forgotten. In 2007, on a chilly February morning in a small Oregon town, the old county library sat quiet and unassuming, a place where the soft rustle of turning pages and the low murmur of whispered conversations filled the air like a secret lullaby. The library was a relic of the past, its wooden shelves heavy with dusty tomes, its corridors a labyrinth of memories. But that morning, something in the air felt different, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. It began in the circulation desk, where a tidy stack of returned books awaited processing. Among them was one that made the heart of longtime librarian Evelyn Barnes skip a beat, a leather-bound volume titled Tales of the Supernatural. Evelyn had known this book for years. Its spine was smooth and unblemished, its cover seemingly untouched by time. Strangely, it had no dust, no wear, like it had been handled only yesterday. Even more bizarre was the due date slip tucked inside, stamped in bold letters. Returned, February 14th, 2007. That particular stamp had not been in use since 1995. Evelyn frowned, her fingers trembling slightly as she examined the slip. According to the library's records, Tales of the Supernatural had been checked out back in 1982 by a man named Richard Graves, a name that sent a shiver down her spine for reasons she could not quite explain. She quickly retrieved his file from the dusty archives in the back office. The record was brief and unremarkable until she reached the final note. Richard Graves had died in a car crash in 1983. Her heart pounded in her chest. How could a book, checked out over 20 years ago by a dead man, suddenly find its way back to the library? Evelyn's mind raced with questions as she stared at the crisp, new stamp. It was as if some unseen force had taken it upon itself to return the book on a Valentine's Day that was long after the man who had borrowed it had perished. Evelyn gathered a few of her colleagues, their faces etched with curiosity and concern. "I don't understand," she said, her voice low and wavering. "Richard Graves, he's been dead for over 20 years. Yet here's his book, returned as if he'd just dropped it off." Her colleagues exchanged uneasy glances. The library had its share of old legends and eerie tales, but nothing like this. It was as if the library itself was reaching out from the past, borrowing time from a dead borrower. Later that afternoon, after the initial shock had subsided into a persistent, gnawing unease, Evelyn decided to dig deeper. She scoured the records and the physical logbooks that recorded the library's history. Every piece of evidence pointed to one unsettling fact. Tales of the Supernatural was immaculate, a relic preserved beyond its years. No one could explain why the book showed no signs of age despite being checked out in the early 80s. And that stamp, it was as if time itself had been rewritten on that slip of paper. As dusk fell over the small town, the library emptied, leaving Evelyn alone amidst the quiet stacks. The silence was palpable, thick and heavy, almost as if it were a presence in its own right. She wandered through the aisles, her footsteps soft on the old wooden floor, her eyes drifting over the spines of countless books. Every so often, she could almost swear she heard a whisper, a soft murmur that seemed to come from the very pages of the books. The sound was faint, barely audible, and yet it filled her with an inexplicable dread. Perhaps it was just my imagination, she thought, shaking her head. But deep down, she knew that something was very, very wrong. The library, with its storied past and forgotten lore, had always been a repository of secrets. Yet nothing had ever hinted at the possibility that the past could reach out and claim its dues in the present. That night, as Evelyn closed up the library, she couldn't shake the image of Richard Graves from her mind, the mysterious borrower who had returned his book from beyond the grave. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and echoing footsteps in endless corridors. In her dreams, a deep, gravelly voice whispered, "The books whisper back, listen." She awoke with a start, heart racing and sheets tangled around her legs, as if the very night had tried to pull her back into the darkness of the library. The next morning, still trembling from her nightmares, Evelyn decided to ask one last question before dismissing the bizarre incident as nothing more than an overactive imagination. Could the book have been returned by someone else, by some entity that had taken on Richard Graves' identity? The thought was absurd, yet the evidence was undeniable. There was no explanation that fit the facts. Determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, Evelyn contacted a local historian, Mr. Langford, who had written extensively about the town's past. When she presented him with the details, the book, the slip, the dead borrower, his eyes widened in a mix of shock and something else, fear, perhaps. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Many years ago," he began, "there were rumors about Richard Graves. They said that he wasn't an ordinary man. Some even whispered that he had dabbled in the occult. There are legends in our town about a man who could borrow not only books but also something more, time itself. Some say he struck a bargain, and in doing so, he tethered his very soul to this library." Evelyn shuddered as Mr. Langford continued, his voice barely audible over the steady drip of rain outside. "When he died, his body may have perished in that terrible car crash, but his presence, his essence, might have lingered on. And it's said that every once in a while, the past catches up with the present. Perhaps on that fateful day in 2007, Richard Graves, if he can be called that, decided to return his book." The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Evelyn felt as if the library itself had taken on a new life, a living entity with its own memories and secrets. She began to see the library in a different light, not merely a building filled with books, but a keeper of histories, a guardian of the unseen and the unspoken. In the days that followed, whispers about the mysterious return spread among the staff and even the regular patrons. Some claimed that, late at night, if you sat alone in a quiet corner of the library, you could hear the soft rustle of pages and a faint, ghostly echo of a man's voice calling out. Others reported seeing a shadow move among the stacks, a shadow that seemed to vanish whenever you tried to get a closer look. Evelyn herself couldn't help but wonder, were the libraries of the world filled with more than just stories and silence? In her heart, she felt that every book held a secret, every return slip a silent whisper of what once was, and perhaps what still is. In the quiet moments after closing time, when the library's ancient walls absorbed the fading light, she would sometimes hear the soft, almost imperceptible sound of a page turning, a reminder that the past, in all its eerie persistence, was never truly gone. The mystery of tales of the supernatural and its spectral borrower became a legend in that small town, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones to those who dared linger in the library after dark. And though no one ever saw Richard Graves again, his story became intertwined with the fabric of the library. In every creak of a wooden floorboard and every flutter of a page, there was a lingering question. Who or what is borrowing our time? As the years passed, new librarians came and went, but the legend endured. Visitors who spent long, quiet hours among the stacks claimed that if they listened carefully, they could hear the echoes of the past, the rustle of pages, the soft thump of a returned book, and sometimes the faint, disembodied whisper of a man's voice saying, "I'm back." So next time you find yourself alone in a library, take a moment to listen. Amid the quiet chatter of other patrons and the soft hum of fluorescent lights, you might just catch a whisper, a secret murmur from the shelves. And if you're really lucky, you might glimpse the faint outline of a man who never really left, a reminder that some books, they whisper back. For the libraries of the world are not just repositories of stories. They are living, breathing sanctuaries of memory and mystery, where the past and the present intertwine in unexpected ways. And every so often, when the clock strikes just the right hour, the last borrower comes calling once more. Remember, the next time you're alone among the silent stacks, listen carefully. You might not be as alone as you think.